the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. Her research interests include informal worker organizing and worker rights, redistributive policies and social protection, agrarian transformation, and the changing nature of work. Without any further delay, I am going to hand over to our presenters. Please enjoy, and we will have a Q&A after, and then we'll go into the breakout rooms and have a more interactive discussion. I think we'll start with Professor Sen. So I'm just going to spotlight you, Professor Sen, so that you are the only person we see on our screens.
Okay. Well, I'm so happy to be here, and I must mention that as an Indian, I also feel quite proud of the fact that I've been invited by this group, REFA, from Johannesburg, where one of our nationalist leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, he was in Johannesburg during 1903 to 13. And from Johannesburg in 1912, he is the person who, on behalf of Indians there and other colored people there, he started the movement on apartheid. And as you can imagine, that was a battle against race inequalities. So just to carry the legacy, I think REFA is now doing many things, a lot of work. And we are in this session, labor and work. I think as much as I got from your concept note and so on, which is very nicely done, I get it that you want to discuss two things. One is the standard curriculum and the limitations of it in the universities, in the undergraduate colleges, particularly relating to labor and work. And the other one is to highlight how labor is deprived in terms of its contribution, which is work, and what are the, what is the background and why it should not prevail, and how it can be corrected, how it can be corrected through the curriculum and through the minds of the young people who will go through that to change the society. Let me first narrate, highlight, what are the limitations of the prevailing curriculum, prevailing economic theory, because we are going to, this session, the whole conference is on rethinking of economics. To rethink it, what are the limitations? How can we critique the point of view, the establishment point of view, which is there in the literature? The first thing is, they deny the fact that labor is exploited. They means the neoclassical, the mainstream theory, which prevails in policy making. Well, they would say that labor market is just like any other market. It's not for human beings who have their own life and their own sort of role in the society. But, it is like any other market. It should be cleared. And they would ignore the fact that human beings have a role in the reproduction process, social reproduction, in how they relate to each other, how they form the society, how they improve the society, and also biological reproduction. If they, if they extinct, then what is going to happen to humanity, and so on. We'll come to this. The other thing, so, if this is the basic critique of labor and work and the use of that in the standard textbooks and so on, we would like to question such arguments. How can we question it? We can question it both conceptually as well as empirically. Now, conceptually, their argument is this absurd argument, you will see, They will say that a laborer, like he or she, the person is in control of his own actions. And while deciding on the action, the person is maximizing the utility. He's a rational human, rational principle. So as a rational human being, the person will maximize the utility by choosing between what? By choosing between work and leisure. As if as a worker, the person is really free, quote unquote free, to choose between leisure and work. If it doesn't work, then he's having more leisure. So that is a trade-off. So this is absurdity to its extreme. And from this, they would now say that the wage rate, the skill, the other terms of employment, whatever they choose, it is according to their own volition. They have chosen it because, they are rational human beings, they are maximizing utility and so on. So then the argument is that, what they get is absolutely fine. There is those who have done economics, you must have come across this term, marginal productivity. Marginal contribution or productivity of anything. Here it is marginal productivity of labor. What is the marginal productivity of labor? How do you measure it? Well, they will say, if a work is going on, if you leave the work, how much is the loss? And if you join the work, how much is the gain? That is your marginal contribution. And you are just paid wage according to your contribution. Well, this is the theory by which they justify whatever the prevailing wage is, and they wouldn't agree that there is any exploitation. Now, in this, we find that even, when there is a recession kind of thing, even when there is COVID, people are sitting at home because there is no work, and the workplaces have closed all over the world, or, they are working from home at half the rate and so on. But they would say, well, the people are now getting better times. They're getting more leisure, and that is their choice. Well, this is not the case. So we have to contest such arguments. Then you also find that the neoclassical theory will not agree that unemployment is something which is not voluntary. In other words, they will say unemployment is always out of your own choice. You don't want to work, therefore you are unemployed. But there was a great economist in 1930s, 36. He came up with his new theory when there was a Great Depression, 1929, etc., all over the world. And when he saw the kind of depression with unemployment, with destitution, then he formulated this argument, both theoretically as well as empirically, that there is involuntary unemployment. Unemployment is not due to the choice of an individual, but the individual wants to work, but there is no work, and that's why the person is unemployed. And there is no work because there is no demand for such work, and there is no demand for such work because no production. That is a standard example of a recession. The COVID-led world also, we are going through the same. Now, in this situation, you find also, if we have to critique neoclassical theory, we must also admit what all there, apart from these conceptual things, what all there leaving aside. I said at the beginning that it is both conceptual as well as empirical. Now, empirics include current position, where you find all over unemployment and the kind of destitution and so on. Also, it includes history. It includes history, and I think especially for developing countries, for the global south, we need to know history, how the situation has come up, where labor is exploited to any extent. Now, to go back to history, we find that we need to talk about colonialism, we need to talk about neo-colonial period and globalization. So to go back, let's go back to colonialism. under colonialism, what happened, that one can find a clue as to the exploitation of people by using all kinds of criteria. One is subordination, political subordination. Countries were conquered, quote unquote conquered, captured, one after another. And in that process, what you find, that the people who are subordinated, they are treated very differently. And in many cases, they are treated according to the race, the color of the skin, or, being in another country and so on. So there you find that under colonialism, well, certain things came up where people, I think I go back, well, just a minute. I think let's finish colonialism first. So under colonialism, if we now talk about Africa, how this country has been exploited over time, how the people of this country have been exploited. One was slavery. And then beyond slavery also, when you find that people had migrated to different countries, not only Africans, but us, many other people from all over the world, they have migrated, they're still migrating, they're trying to migrate. Think of Syria, the question of the Middle East. Now those migrants, they face a very hard deal. They are treated very differently. And you find how the migrants in USA and UK, how they're being treated today. So, it starts from colonialism and it permits to the current period, and you find, the inequalities. Now, here, I think I also talk a little bit about the conceptual aspects, yes. How labor, first of all, let me make this statement and then explain it. My statement is, labor is exploited by capital, yes. And capital is in close alliance with the ruling state. Therefore, capital has the backing of it is capitalism after all. And in capitalism, you can't expect anything other than in a free market, those who control capital, they are getting all the privileges. They are being supported by the state. Now, in this kind of a situation, let's go back to history. How did this happen? How did it start up? We go back to 1845, when Frederick Engels wrote a wonderful book, The History of the Working Class in Britain. Now, what he did, he was very young, in his 20s. He was in Manchester, and he looked at the working condition of the people in industry. Industrial revolution had already come up, and the condition of the working people in Manchester City. And he was dismayed, and he wrote this book, and he pointed out very clearly what are the sources of exploiting labor. Now, the sources include, number one, dispossession. They don't have any property rights. How? Well, it happens because there is some accumulation, and the accumulated capital is controlled by one set of people, call them capitalists. And the other set of people who are dispossessed, maybe, they were in villages, they had a piece of land, and they were lured by the prospect of getting a job in the city, Manchester City. They came, they left behind their labor, and also they were too poor to continue on, they left behind their land, and they are in the city now. So they are dispossessed. So in this situation, who controls? The control is for people who have power, and the power is for people who are capitalists. And when they make use of labor, they do not pay them their contribution. They would think, that is neoclassical theory again, that they would think that capital has its right due share, and labor is paid according to whatever this marginal product and so on. So the wages are very low, and there comes up a surplus, and that surplus is the surplus which Engels and Marx and many others today are talking about, that labor is being exploited in many ways, and one of them is not to pay the wages at a rate which is even enough for subsistence. So in this kind of a situation, we talk a little bit, we have left behind colonialism. Now we talk about neo-colonies. What are the neo-colonies? Neo-colonies include your countries, my country, many other newly politically independent countries who got political independence, but not economic independence, not economic sovereignty. Now, in this kind of situation, what happens that a lot of industries are coming up, and when the industries are coming up, they are being controlled. Initially, they are controlled by the domestic capitalists. They also, they operate in a similar manner, that they get a large share of the output, much larger than what the workers get, okay? Then gradually, it sweeps, I'm trying to minimize my speech so that I don't take other people's time, right? What is the time, Saira, now? Hello?
Yes, the time is now 1:25. You can wrap up in 2 minutes?
5 minutes, if you please. Okay, I'll try. Now then, what is happening that in this kind of a situation, when people are working, there is this argument about freeing the market, and one of the argument is to free the capital market. So a lot of capital is moving around, floating around, settling in the countries where labor is very, very cheap, and therefore surplus is much greater for the capital, for the capitalists. So this is the kind of situation where the global capital is moving around, and you find there's a global chain in production, which you have heard of, and in your country, in my country, in all over in global south, the capital which is coming from outside, they're having a large, they're having a lot of profit because of the fact that labor is very cheap, and even raw materials, mining, all these things are there. So between these things, we have just surveyed the situation. In 1 minute, I'll sum up, try to, the new courses, changing the syllabus should take care of all these things. They should take care, they should also have a critique of neoclassical economics. They should have a survey of history. Without history, economics cannot survive. And then finally, they should provide the real truth, the truth behind the veil, and which will enlighten the minds of the younger people and the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. We're going to have questions after all the speakers have presented. But just on that note, I always found it interesting that as an undergrad studying economics, the option to take a course on the history of economics was only offered in my 3rd year when I was finishing, and not right at the beginning when we start. And that was very peculiar. Siviwe, can we go to your presentation?
Yes.
Are you ready for us?
I'll unmute myself.
Thank you so much, Prof. We can mute you, but if you can mute yourself, that's also fine.
No, I'll not speak when she speaks.
Okay. Can I begin? Okay. Good afternoon, all. My name is Siviwe Mhlana. I am an economist and independent research consultant, currently working as a project assistant for WIEGO, which is a global research and advocacy network focused on improving the livelihoods of workers in the informal economy. It is an honor to be once again joined with you today to rethink economics, and at such a critical moment in our global economy. And in the limited time that I have with you today, my presentation will just be to sort of synthesize the understanding of labor markets under the mainstream model, and to hopefully think about how we can expand this narrow theoretical framework to include the experiences of African people in the African context. And Prof. Sunanda touched on this a little bit, so I will be very brief. So my presentation is just going to be structured as follows. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of the neoclassical understanding of labor markets, and then as a critique of that understanding, I'll just give a description of the unemployment trends in post-apartheid South Africa, and then conclude with some suggestions for how we can contextualize African economies. So very briefly, the neoclassical understanding of labor markets is that the economy is unbiased in its creation of work. So as Prof. Sunanda noted, the understanding is that workers can choose to work or not, and they can also choose how much time that they put into work depending on their preferences and the level of real wages in the economy. And in the absence of any form of rigidity, the supply and demand for labor will be equal to one another, and we will, the understanding is that we will reach full employment. Based on this approach, the higher the wage rate, the higher the supply of labor, and the lower the demand will be. Workers will give over their time to work in a way that balances the utility gain from consuming the real wage with the utility of leisure time. So in this understanding, actual hours will always equal the desired hours. And in this case, paid work will always be on terms that are supposedly, favorable to workers. You will never find under, this understanding, you'll never find a case where workers are working more than they want to earn or at wages that are lower than they would like to earn. And so in the same vein, unemployment will be due to an excess supply of labor and real wages being too high. And in order to bring us back to full employment, we'd have to adjust downwards to decrease the labor supply and increase the demand for labor in the market. And as Prof. Sunanda also mentioned, that in this case, unemployment is really voluntary leisure. So workers would, undertake this voluntary leisure if they found that their reservation wage or the lowest amount that a worker would be willing to take on a job is higher than the equilibrium wage. But as we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, this is not the case. Labor markets don't, function in a way that can simply be reduced in terms of supply and demand in the labor market and how these factors interact with one another. In fact, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're finding, according to the ILO, is that 495 million jobs have already been lost worldwide. 35 million more people are likely to be among the global working poor. The informal economy is bearing significant impacts as a result of this pandemic. ILO estimates suggest that relative poverty for workers in the informal economy is expected to increase by 56 percentage points in low and lower income countries compared to 21 percentage points in upper middle income countries. But we're also finding that, these trends or vulnerability to the COVID-19 pandemic has also been very much gendered, right? So, women, the ILO states that about 70% of the health and social service sector is women. And we're also finding, as a result of the lockdown, the global lockdowns that have had to take place and other measures that have been implemented to mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, women's burden of balancing paid work and unpaid care work in an economy has also increased. We know that women are disproportionately more likely to be in low wage or low paying jobs in the informal sector without social protections compared to their male counterparts. But also, since about 40%, almost 40% of the global population lacks access to social services, and we still have, persistent inequities in the distribution of care work in society. It is women that are, often have to provide these services when they're not provided for by the job or by the government. But as with the financial crisis of 2008, the global social and economic crisis presented by the COVID-19 pandemic is not a consequence of, some specialized and unpredictable outcomes of an otherwise well-functioning system. Rather, the current crisis effectively stems from decades of deregulation, privatization, declining employment security, reductions in the benefits of employment, and public disinvestment. And the South African labor market has not, been shielded from these global trends in economic and workplace restructuring. Labor market restructuring and the restructuring of global production networks have led to rising unemployment in the South African economy. The official unemployment rate now stands at 29.1%. Moreover, studies have shown that throughout the post-Apartheid period, the informalization work has also been on the rise. In addition, the racial disparities in earnings have also persisted throughout the post-Apartheid period, with Black women disproportionately more likely to be in low-paying jobs compared to their white and or male counterparts. So what these trends are suggesting is that, contrary to the neoclassical understanding of labor markets are in fact not perfect. They're also not unbiased in their provision of good or bad jobs in the economy. Hence, in line with Humphreys and Rubery, we could argue that it is in fact the industrial structure and not the supply of good high or low quality labor that determines the supply of good or bad jobs in the economy. Which then brings us to then how do we then contextualize African economies in economic thinking? Several scholars have argued that the neoclassical approach has been to separate labor markets from its social and historical context. A starting point, and I know Ben Fine has suggested this, and is that a starting point would be to understand the conditions under which labor markets are formed and restructured over time. And this is also, something that has been done, and it can be done. It's a methodology that we use in our research when we actually want to study the realities of, of work. Earlier studies have included, your dual labor market theories, the understanding that you have, that the labor markets are divided into two sectors, your formal and your informal, that, discrimination exists in terms of access to good or bad jobs in the economy. And also your segmented labor market theory approach, which is that even within, labor markets do differ from other markets, other types of markets, but also within labor markets, there are differentiations that exist in terms of the characteristics, the behaviors and the rules of those types of jobs. And for example, your wages, your working conditions, the type of job, the hours of the job, and also things like entitlement. However, some, Marxist scholars have critiqued this approach as well, to say that as much it is a step forward from, your human capital theories, it is also still kind of ignoring the other aspects of or factors that affect work in an economy. So worker organization, negotiations, conflicts, and it has been suggested
surplus populations that I think has garnered increasing attention as we discuss crises of reproduction, and to do it through the case of Mozambique, which, though bordering on South Africa, is quite distinct in a myriad of ways. So I think that we've seen this growing body of literature that points to a crisis of social reproduction and surplus populations. But what's interesting is that much of this debate overlooks the historical role of so-called surplus populations within the context of capitalist development, both in the global north, but also in the global south. It also overlooks the ways in which seemingly surplus populations are actually subsumed under capitalism through all sorts of forms of casual wage labor, petty commodity production, and consumption. And this was actually an insight that Lenin reflected on in his analysis of the peasantry in Russia. But in my own research in Mozambique, and I look at rural Mozambique, you see some dynamics that are not dissimilar from those. And finally, and this was also something that Siviwe pointed out, is the role of resistance and contentious politics, and the way that that has shaped the nature of labor markets and the nature of work. And so I hope through this case study to both emphasize the importance, as already has been highlighted, of counter-positivist analysis of history, of power in all its forms, that helps us bring some of the theory closer to the reality and the lived experiences of workers and people. And I should say that I'm not actually an economist. So I'm very happy to have been able to get such a wonderful introduction to sort of standard neoclassical economics teaching and what the problems are, because that's something that we won't be focusing on in this presentation. But what I'm interested in is to kind of go back and peel back to some of these concepts. Well, what is work? And how has work been shaped by colonial capitalism? And what is the nature of work in the post-colonial period? How does our analysis of work influence contentious politics in the directions we pursue? And how can this counter-positivist paradigm help to advance struggles, right? Because I think that ultimately one of the objectives of thinking about work and workers is thinking about how to improve livelihoods, how to improve the conditions of life. And so, you know, there's a lot of definitions of what work really is. And what's interesting is even to compare a definition, the dominant definition in rural Mozambique, which is a socially useful activity that requires physical, intellectual, and emotional efforts and allows households to reproduce themselves, to compare that definition to others. Eddie Webster, for instance, and Buhlungu and others came up with a definition that is very much linked to time and space. And of course, this itself is a reflection of the organization of production, right? And so if you're in an agrarian context where the seasonal rhythms of cultivation vary, where you're rotating between mashambas, between farms, and other forms of wage labor and side hustles, then space is also not the defining feature of work. Now, there's many ways, and this was already alluded to, right? In thinking about productive and reproductive labor and its relationship. And I think the first thing to highlight is that these terms are always in function of capitalism. We sometimes forget that, right? But if we think about, well, productive for whom, really what we're talking about is productive for capital. It's about contributing directly to capital accumulation. And reproductive labor is in some ways reproductive or reproduces capitalism. It contributes to the reproduction of capitalism as a whole. Hughes, in her analysis of labor in the digital economy, comes up with this typology. And I'm always somewhat reluctant to talk about typologies, but I thought it was useful to think about how these different quadrants of paid and unpaid, productive and reproductive, formal and informal labor interact together and contribute to capital accumulation. So that you can have, for instance, paid reproductive work, such as teaching, which prepares the workforce for the labor market. You can have unpaid reproductive work, whether it's child rearing, or in the case of Mozambique, we have this category in the labor force survey called unpaid family labor, which tends to actually be women, small-scale farmers who are kind of relegated to the realm of food crop production, right? And there's all these subjectivities of how data and labor force service gets. captured. And then you have paid productive labor, which is that which contributes directly to capital accumulation through the process that Professor Sunanda Sen already spoke about. And then Hughes, when she's looking at the digital economy, also highlights this unpaid productive labor, which is the labor of consumption. It's the labor of us doing our internet banking or booking our holidays online. It's still contributing to accumulation, but it's in fact us, the consumers, who are doing that work. So this is just, it's a typology to help us think about these categories. It's not supposed to be set in stone or applied to all. So given this wide range, right, of productive, reproductive, formal, informal, paid and unpaid work, which is recognized as legitimate work in the context of Mozambique, well, how do we think about that within the process of the making of wage work? And of course, as has already been mentioned, it would be misplaced to think about wage work today as disarticulated from the processes of colonial capitalism. And for those of you that know about the relationship between Mozambique and South Africa, you'll know that Mozambique was a country colonized by an undercapitalized colonial power, the Portuguese, who basically parceled off sections of the country to different elements of British capital. You can see these different Mozambique companies, it was mostly British capital behind them, to serve the interests of accumulation of neighboring countries. And southern Mozambique, which was under the direct administration of the state, became a labor recruitment area for the mines in South Africa. So in fact, Wenela, which has now become Theba, had a monopoly over recruitment in that area. And that was such an important source of foreign exchange to Mozambique, an important source of traffic to its ports and railways. So the development of Mozambique was intimately tied to the development of South Africa, but as a sort of extension, let's say, of the labor reserves that existed here. And Professor Sen already spoke about the processes of expropriation, enslavement, exploitation, and then subsequent exclusion, right? And such an element or an integral part of Southern Africa was this regional migrant labor system, where you had a process of proletarianization, but one that was permanently temporary. And Harold Walpe and others have developed these theories around the subsidy theory that, illustrate how the reserves functioned to subsidize the low wages of wage workers across Southern Africa. But there's an interesting debate here between Walpe and Mafeje, where Mafeje says, there's resistance. And we shouldn't simply interpret the nature of labor in Mozambique or the nature of labor in the reserves in South Africa as functional, right, to capitalism. These kinds of functionalist approaches ignore the ways in which workers and people themselves rose up and tried to carve out spaces of autonomy from colonial capitalism, and that those are very important to take into account. Regardless of how we understand the process, I think that the important thing, and I'm borrowing from Walter Rodney, is to say that Southern Africa went through a process of primitive accumulation, but that it did not follow the same trajectory as the global north. And Ruth first wrote this book on Mozambique that was called The Mozambican Miner, Proletarian and Peasant. And that has in fact been the context for the Mozambican labor market, is this sort of movement between proletarian and peasant, where the peasantry could not exist without the wage income for migrant wage labor, but where migrant wage labor generally pays so little that people are still relying on land to cobble together a livelihood. Now, if we look, and this is the latest data from the census, we don't have a labor force survey, but you see that only 12% of the economically active population in Mozambique are salaried workers. And this has kind of led to a whole narrative that portrays the majority of Mozambicans as small-scale farmers, who are subsistence farmers, who are disarticulated from capitalism. In some cases, there's a romanticized idea. This is the kind of what Andre Gores would call the authentic labor, right? People that have not been alienated from the means of production and so on and so on. And yet what we see is that actually underlying these categories of self-employed and unpaid family worker is a dense web of casual employment relationships, workers who are not covered by labor and social protections. And I think that what I wanted to highlight just with this is that the importance of triangulating data from these household surveys with other kinds of research, ethnographic research, that can help you tease out what the problems are. And we see that some of the key problems with household surveys are their definitions, the focus on primary economic activity in a context where people are cobbling together a livelihood from a multiplicity of activities, the reference period, right, which is usually like, what did you do in the last week, where there's all these patterns of migrancy. And for countries that don't have the resources to do the kind of labor force survey that South Africa has, it becomes really difficult to adequately capture what is actually happening in the labor market. And that has major implications for the kinds of policies that then are pursued. This is borrowed from WIEGO, actually, so I'm really glad that Siviwe is here. I just wanted to use that as an example in thinking about how to understand and conceptualize the various forms of wage labor, right? Particularly where there's these contractual relationships that are at play. And why this is important is politically. What are the kinds of demands that one mobilizes around? What are the kinds of policies that we want to show? And so WIEGO then tries to conceptualize these various forms of work in terms of what is the nature of the contract, what are the types of remuneration, how much autonomy do workers have over the means of production, what is the nature of the workplace, etc. And critical to this is an understanding that there is this cobbling together of livelihoods that in much of Southern Africa is rooted in this colonial experience. This is a picture of a Mozambican miner coming back to Mozambique, taken by Moira Forjage. I think the key point that I want to bring and has been brought, already by the first two panelists is this emphasis. What does historical analysis give us? What does ethnography give us? And what does triangulation give us in analyzing power and thinking about politically how it is that we improve working conditions in life? Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. All three of you have given us a lot of food for thought. Something that came to mind recently, especially looking at the new data on unemployment in South Africa, is just how severe the situation is. A friend of mine who's also going to be a speaker tomorrow, and a comrade of mine, his son, shared something he read from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is a scholar of decolonization from the continent. And the book that he was reading was called Petals of Blood. And in it, there's a quote, "How could there be unemployment in a country that needed every ounce of labor?" And it's those fundamental questions really that are so relevant for all of us in the global South, and growing in a growing way everywhere, not just in the global South. And it's a question that standard mainstream economics just isn't equipped to answer. Yet political economy has a lot to say on this. So I'm really looking forward to some of the questions that people have. Just to look at the chat, there's a few already, but if you want to ask any of the speakers a question, now's the time. We have 20 minutes dedicated to this before we break out into rooms where we'll have smaller discussions. So please raise your hand and we will come to you and you will be able to ask your question. So I'm just going to read a question from the chat while we wait for people. Rebecca has asked, the argument often advanced in the context of South Africa is that labor in South Africa is too expensive and that labor laws are too rigid. And that rigidity dissuades investment and thus the creation of jobs. What would the presenters say to this? And I must correct myself. This question is not from Rebecca. This question is from Mbuso Moyo. Mbuso, do you want to contextualize your question a little bit more in person? Or do you want to just turn your audio on or share in the chat? Either way, I'm going to post the question to everyone, and maybe we can go to the speakers and hear what they think about that. That is a question that we're also considering as we talk about the universal basic income and the demand for that and the level that it needs to be put at. Siviwe, maybe we can come to you and then go to Ruth and Prof. Sen. The question again is, the argument often advanced in the context of South Africa is that labor is too expensive and that labor laws are too rigid. And that rigidity dissuades investment and thus the creation of jobs.
Okay. So what I would say, actually, part of my my research, my master's research, was on the changing nature of work and growing precarity in the post-Apartheid period. And so based on that, I would say actually labor laws in South Africa are not as rigid as people would like us to think. In the post-Apartheid period, what we've seen is a growing casualization and informalization of work. And at the same time, you know, wages are not increasing in the way, you know, that they would like us to think they are. People are, you know, working, but they can't afford to live. There's a lot of, a large population of people in the working poor in South Africa. The protections around jobs are diminishing with time. And then the idea that the wages are too high. I actually read a paper recently. I might link it later. But the idea, it's an older paper by Heinz, and the idea that, okay, African economies need to decrease wages, it's that neoclassical understanding, right? That, oh, we need to decrease wages so that we can increase the demand for labor in the economy. But then the question is then how much are we going to decrease wages? And at what point is that going to be sufficient? Our wages are already too high, people can't, too low, people can't survive. So when you decrease wages from rock bottom, how much further is that, like, who does that benefit? It's definitely not the workers. But also, Prof. Leons, I think in the plenary last night, mentioned how you know, these incentives that are supposedly supposed to increase investments aren't actually even doing that. So decreasing wages is not necessarily going to end up with the, you know, workers benefiting from that either. So yeah, those are just my thoughts on that, because yeah, labor laws are definitely not rigid, and what we're seeing is that diminishing protections around labor in South Africa, and all to the disadvantage of workers and working people.
Yeah, I fully concur. Professor Sen, I know you want to say something, and then we'll go to...
Yeah, right. Well, this is a standard argument which is put forth by those who believe, the officials who believe in neoclassical theory. Let me talk about, in this context, about India. You see, in the beginning, not just India, but the whole of Global South. In the beginning, the argument was that do not have any hindrance, do not have any restriction on the flow of capital, because then capital will shy away, it will not come to your country. Now the argument has become, it's more twisted, that look, you know, capital is ready to come. It's at the door, but labor is too expensive, like, you know, the South African question. So this is a standard package of global chain in production, that capital will move to those countries where labor is the cheapest, you know. This is the choice on part of capital. And of course, here comes the question of power and relative strength of, I mean, if labor is very weak, it has no, in India, a lot of labor regulations were there in the beginning when the country started with independence. Now, one by one, recently, the labor codes are all dismantled. And now, you know, this is flexible labor. You can hire and fire anytime you want to, and casualization and outsourcing when people work from home, and they don't follow any formal labor regulation. So this is the situation. This is the situation. And it really reflects on the relative position of labor in under capitalism. Yep.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ruth, would you want to come in here?
Yeah, sure. So I think that there's this interesting contradiction because wage labor and employment is considered a measure of well-being, and yet there's an argument that in order to extend it, you have to chip away at what makes it actually a worthwhile endeavor to begin with, you know. And I mean, I've been in these debates many times, and when we go back to some of the tenets of the idea of wage labor, it's that it sustains those who have been expropriated from the means of production. And so then what's the point, right? If it can't sustain people. I also think there's questions around, and this depends on the structure of different economies, but around aggregate demand. So if people are not earning enough, then they're also not consuming enough, right? And there is a relationship in capitalism with wages and consumption that can drive accumulation and growth. I think for the case of Mozambique, what's interesting is that 90% of investment in Mozambique goes into the extractive sector and adjacent infrastructure. So it goes into mining, it goes into the gas, it goes into the coal, it goes into the roads and the railways that take the gas abroad, right? And that creates 15% of wage labor in Mozambique. 90% of investment creates 15% of wage labor. And meanwhile, you have no investment in labor-intensive areas such as agriculture, right, or industry. I mean, Mozambique has experienced a process of a deindustrialization as the country opened up, as it let down its trade barriers and so on, which has spiraled unemployment, and the trade union movement actually has never recovered. So I think that we have to also think about where is it that our countries are located within the global economy, and how does this resource-driven approach limit actually the ability to create employment. And also just to highlight that in the case of Mozambique, these large multinational corporations have benefited from tremendous fiscal exemptions, right? They have written off whatever investment they've made in infrastructure off of paying taxes. So the Mozambican government has not been able to leverage these extractive industries in order to have some kind of other form of redistribution. And what you're seeing now in Mozambique is an insurgency against the state, which everyone is up in arms about, but it was absolutely predictable given the process of expropriation, the focus on the extractive industries, and the lack of any form of redistribution, be that through wages and employment, or be that through universal basic income or cash transfers.
There's a second question from Josh. How do we reconcile the failure of the labor market to remove people from poverty with South Africa's persistently high unemployment rate, or rather the few people who are formally employed? Is labor market wage a viable way out of poverty? What else needs to happen? And that would probably touch on the point you just made about cash transfers, Ruth, but before I come back to you, let's go back to Siviwe, and then in that order. Siviwe, if you know, any of you, if there's something you don't want to explicitly say on a question, you don't have to answer it. You can throw it back at us, and we'll figure out.
Okay. Well, I just say that, I mean, this has been a concern in the literature. You know, South Africa, you know, in kind of technical terms, has quite a small informal sector in its traditional sense, right? Small informal sector compared to the rest of the region. So sub-Saharan Africa, informal sector is about, I think, 76.8%. And ours is significantly lower. So the idea would be that if we're saying, if the dualist understanding is that, if people can't get formal employment, we would expect them to be, we would expect the informal sector to be much bigger than it is. But the argument has been that, well, and I think Dori Posel has a paper on this, on labor market segmentation, saying that there actually are barriers to entry even within, the kind of informal sector. So we will see that, okay, as much as the unemployment rate is increasing, our informal sector is not necessarily growing as much as we expect it to. And those kind of barriers to entry, I mean, it includes, various things, but at least I know that there's been studies that have looked at women's inability to access credit to, start alternative, create their own work or alternative streams of income. So it is, I think the route would be one to support those initiatives to kind of, make it easier to figure out alternative ways, especially in a time where, as I mentioned earlier, in the South African labor market, it is becoming more and more casualized and informalized, right? Worker protections are also becoming reduced, and security is not necessarily there. So just with that understanding, I would say that perhaps then it would be to kind of support, to make it less difficult for people to, provide for themselves if they decide to, go the informal employment route, but also to fight for these protections and within the quote unquote formal labor market, so that jobs can be protected, so jobs can be meaningful, as Ruth was saying. But yeah, it is a problem of, not having a route out of poverty. But I think, yeah, I'll end there.
Can I have a word? Yeah. I have a question. Is it that the formal sector is trying to get rid of the facilities which are still available for workers who are formally employed? I mean, this is a scene, I'm just trying to compare the scene. You see, in India, only 12% of the working population are in the formal sector. And out of that, more than 50% are casually employed. Gradually they're trying to remove the permanent labor system. Permanent labor means, formal labor. And they're trying to make them casual labor, which will not get any benefit from the corporate, from the firm. So is it the same situation in South Africa?
Can I quickly respond? Yes, I mean, there's a lot of things coming into play, right? So there is the idea of, technology and mechanization happening within, the formal sector. But there's also globalization of jobs. And if we know, the idea of capitalism is to at all times reduce costs. And I think what we're seeing is with the casualization, growing informalization within the formal sector is just to do that. We're seeing closing down. We're seeing at any point where they can cut down those costs, they are doing that. And the casual jobs do lack, benefits and social protections on the job. So it is a very similar case in South Africa as well.
Yeah, and I think with the growing reality of gig economies and platform capitalism, casualization is also evolving in different forms. And I think Ruth will have a lot to say on that. because they're also doing work on the Future of Work project at SKIS. So maybe you want to come in here as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's been interesting about the Future of Work project is that the degrees of digital penetration are really, they vary. And so we, within the project, we've picked 5 countries, Mozambique, Ethiopia, India, are at different levels of economic development that have different structures of the labor market and different levels of digital penetration. So in some instances, we've seen a gig economy without the digital. And that's been really, you know, so Mozambique and Ethiopia are examples of that. You have widespread informality, but it's not happening through the medium of the platform economy. I think what we're seeing is the expansion of those forms of informality into formal spaces. And of course, the COVID pandemic and the whole shift to working from home accelerated that. And in places like South Africa, we're also seeing a kind of a strategy to try to create jobs by inserting oneself, right, into this service sector. So Amazon workers and so on. Similarly, in India, that's also been the case. And so, yeah, it depends on countries. I think there's variation, and that's important to keep in mind. But certainly the COVID pandemic has both highlighted the importance of essential workers and yet accelerated this process of casualization. And, you know, we've started doing some research here. And one of the fascinating things is, yeah, home workers, these teleworkers are treated as though they were autonomous and yet are limited by legally to speak to any of us, right? So they work in isolated environments. They've had to sign all sorts of non-disclosure agreements. And it's been really a kind of, even to do interviews has been very, very difficult to track this. So I think there's all sorts of ways in which the algorithm and algorithmic control is introducing, controls over the labor process that will affect our ability to organize and mobilize, right, around these sectors. Just quickly on the cash transfers, and here I'll take the case of Mozambique as an example. You know, I think that there is a really important role for non-contributory cash transfers and social welfare provisioning, particularly in context of widespread informality. And I've worked quite a lot in Mozambique on trying to extend, for instance, to the elderly and so on. But I think it's also really important to recognize that it does require something to redistribute. So for instance, a universal basic income at the poverty line in Mozambique, at the lower bound poverty line, would cost 115% of the total government budget. Right? So that's not fiscally possible. And until Mozambique can deal with, or address the limitations of an extractivist development model, it most likely will not actually be able to provide the cash transfers necessary. And it's also always important to remember that cash transfers are one among a range of different forms of redistribution. And ultimately for Mozambique, land is a much more powerful one. The fact that people have access to land to fall back on, they're able to commercialize far more from even small scale agricultural production than they would ever get from a cash transfer. And that's important as governments try to move towards privatization of land and maybe use cash transfers as a way to grease that. And it's important to recognize the interlinkages between labor, land, and welfare in order to have a kind of struggle that doesn't let one go, right, at the expense of another.
Great. We had scheduled to go into smaller groups, which are called breakout rooms on Zoom. And we have 15 minutes left, just over 15 minutes left of the session. So what I'd like us to do is to go into those breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back in and close off the session. Why I think the breakout rooms will be interesting is because not everybody has spoken, and this is a workshop setting. We'd really like more interaction. So I'm hoping people will be a bit more confident if you're in groups of 2 or 3 to share some of your thoughts. The particular thing we'd like to ask you to think about is to discuss how to contextualize labor and work in African and global South economies within economic theory. And this can be looked at from your own experiences as either a student, a researcher, or an academic, a teacher. There's few teachers in the chat, so we'll split you all up randomly. And if you happen to have a group that's mixed, take it as an opportunity to also see things from different perspectives. And then we'll come back into the main room before we close the session. So I'm going to create the breakout rooms now. And we will then come back in. You will just have to accept to go into the room.
Sorry, is it for me?
Yeah, you can. So you can. I think it will be nice if you do, if you have the energy, Prof, to join one of the groups. You just have to click on your screen, and then it will take you into the room.
So I'm getting this message, room 4. Shall I join?
Yes, you can join.
Okay. Okay.